What happens when logic becomes law? When emotion is not suppressed, but erased? There have been tyrants. There have been monsters. There have even been gods. But Shockwave is something else. Something colder, smarter, more patient. He doesn't rage. He doesn't boast. He waits. He plans. And then, when the time is right, he acts. For eons, his presence lurked behind Decepticon war councils and Autobot paranoia, and when he finally moved, entire timelines bent to his design. To some, he's the ultimate traitor. To others, the purest Decepticon. But across every continuity, one truth remains. Shockwave is the enemy you never see coming. And by the time you do, it's already too late. This is Disassembled, Heroes and Villains, and today we take a look at one of the most monstrous characters in Transformers history, the cold and calculating Shockwave. To understand Shockwave is to understand the danger of pure logic when unanchored by compassion or emotion. He did not rise through the ranks by fire and fury, but by calculation and cold, unflinching reason. When the Transformers animated series premiered in 1984, audiences were introduced to a kaleidoscope of characters, noble Autobots, brutish Decepticons, and cosmic threats. But among them, one figure stood out, not because he shouted louder or fought harder, but because he didn't. Shockwave was quiet, deliberate, and utterly chilling. Introduced in More Than Meets the Eye Part 1, Shockwave was left behind to guard Cybertron while Megatron led the Decepticons to Earth, a role he would hold for millions of years. While this might seem like a demotion, it was a position of immense power. Shockwave was not simply a gatekeeper, he was the silent custodian of an empire's heart, and in this silence, his mind worked. Watched, calculated. Though his screen time was limited in Sunbow's series, every appearance was deliberate. Whether he was sending reinforcements through space bridges or reporting Cybertron's status with deadpan precision, Shockwave was portrayed as loyal, but disturbingly impersonal. His voice, monotone and eerie, became a hallmark of his presence. Even Megatron, for all his dominance, seemed to regard Shockwave not as a subordinate, but as a near equal best kept at arm's length. But in Marvel Comics' Transformers series, that quiet equality gave way to something far darker. Here, Shockwave wasn't just chilling, he was catastrophic. From the moment he stepped onto the page in his first appearance in 1985's The Transformers issue 4, the tone of the story changed. As Ratchet looked on in horror, the hulking, emotionless Shockwave slaughtered the Autobots. Their corpses hung suspended in the Ark, a grotesque monument to his efficiency. And then, Shockwave did the unthinkable. He defeated Megatron, not in a climactic, hard-won battle, but as part of a calculated coup. Tron's defeat was just another variable in Shockwave's equation for dominance. By issue 5, Shockwave had declared himself Decepticon leader, and even Optimus Prime had been decapitated and wired into Shockwave's twisted experiments. With the creation matrix extracted from his mind, Shockwave forged new life forms, the Constructicons and Triple Changers, treating creation itself as just another algorithm to solve. In these pages, Shockwave wasn't just a strategist. He was a cybernetic demigod playing with the lives and sparks of others. But unlike Megatron, whose leadership relied on strength, fear, and charisma, Shockwave ruled by logic, cold, efficient logic. And yet, even his reason had limits. Over time, cracks formed. Ratchet, one of the least combat-oriented Autobots, outmaneuvered him, not through violence, but through insight. In Transformers issues 7 and 8, Ratchet used Megatron's pride against Shockwave, reigniting the rivalry between them. Where Shockwave would use logic and reasoning to calculate probabilities, he could not account for every variable, and in that uncertainty, Shockwave faltered. His arc in Marvel Comics was long and winding. He returned in Transformers issue 24 and 25, attempting once again to seize power. Later issues showed him working behind the scenes, manipulating both factions. Even in defeat, he remained a looming presence, a reminder that the greatest dangers are not always loud. Sometimes they are silent, inevitable. It's important to note how different this was from the Shockwave of the cartoon. In the Sunbow series, loyalty was his defining trait. He obeyed Megatron without question, reporting from Cybertron and ensuring the space bridge functioned properly. But even there, seeds of something deeper were planted. His cold demeanor and emotionless delivery hinted that his loyalty wasn't driven by passion or belief. It was simply logical. So what changed in the comics? The answer may lie in his backstory. In Transformers issue 39, it's revealed that Shockwave believes in the ultimate evolution of the Decepticon cause, not through domination, but through perfection. To him, war is inefficient. Emotion is a weakness. He doesn't crave power to feel powerful. He seeks it because, in his mind and through his calculations, he is the only one capable of wielding it correctly. And yet, For all his intellect, Shockwave underestimates chaos. He cannot fathom the unpredictability of emotion, nor the resilience of hope. And time again, this flaw proves fatal. In both the cartoons and the comics, Shockwave stands apart. He's not driven by pride like Starscream, nor by conquest like Megatron. He doesn't crave status or validation. What he seeks is order, an order only he can enforce. He's a scientist, a tactician, and an ideologue, swearing allegiance to rational thinking. It's his purity that makes him terrifying. By the end of his Marvel Comics run, Shockwave had cycled through roles: leader, usurper, exile, but never vanished completely. Even when off-panel, his presence haunted the narrative, becoming more than just a villain. And in that threat, we begin to see a pattern. From the earliest G1 episodes to his most chilling Marvel exploits, Shockwave evolves not through reinvention, but refinement. Always calm, always calculating, but never quite exhibiting those qualities that allow other characters to appear so human-like. He is not the flame, he is the ice. And in that cold, a new kind of terror waits. But logic doesn't always wear the same face. In G1 and Marvel, Shockwave was cold, commanding, and unmistakably alien, a figure who stood apart from the battlefield, manipulating it from above. But in another universe, one more stylized, more subversive, his logic took a new form. He didn't conquer through force or rebellion, he infiltrated, and behind the visor of an Autobot, he waited. Some betrayals are loud, explosions, declarations, revolts, but others hide in plain sight. When Transformers Animated premiered in 2007, it brought with it a fresh art style and a bold new tone, but perhaps its most subversive twist lay not in action, but deception. Shockwave didn't begin as Shockwave. He entered the series as Longarm Prime, a high-ranking Autobot intelligence officer introduced in the second season. With a calm voice, respectful tone, and a reputation for efficiency, Longarm quickly became a trusted pillar of the Autobot hierarchy, particularly within the Elite Guard. His word carried weight, his advice was sought, his loyalty was never questioned, and that trust was his weapon. Longarm, using the naivete of Bumblebee to his advantage, accused Wasp of being a Decepticon spy, manipulating evidence to ensure his guilt. This wasn't brute sabotage, it was psychological warfare at its most insidious. Wasp was dishonorably discharged, cast out, and branded a traitor by his own kind. But what makes it even worse is what followed. Wasp's mind unraveled. He became obsessed with clearing his name, devolving into a paranoid fugitive. By the time we see him again in Where Is Thy Sting, Wasp is unhinged, his speech erratic, his optics wide with trauma. He blamed Bumblebee for his downfall, unable to see the true manipulator who destroyed his life. Wasp wasn't just framed, he was shattered, and Shockwave watched it all with clinical detachment. The reveal that Longarm Prime was Shockwave all along landed like a thunderclap. For nearly 2 full seasons, this monster had sat in Autobot command rooms, advised Optimus, and shaped military policy, all while feeding information to Megatron. The dual role wasn't just clever writing, it was chilling. For a children's cartoon, Animated dared to ask, what if the most dangerous enemy wasn't the one firing the blaster, but the one giving the orders? Shockwave's betrayal wasn't theatrical, it was quiet, a change in tone, a flicker of purple optics. His voice shifted from calm to cold, and the truth set in. The Autobots had been living beside a ghost. And then came the consequences. And this is why I hate machines. Shockwave attacked Ultra Magnus, the Autobots' supreme commander. It wasn't just treacherous, it was vicious. He beat Magnus nearly to death, leaving him comatose and symbolically decapitating Autobot leadership. The attack shattered not just the body, but an entire chain of command. Now exposed, Shockwave returned to Megatron's side and assumed his true form, taller, leaner, with a single red eye and a jagged Decepticon frame. He took charge of cloning operations, engineering an army of protoforms and specialized soldiers. His scientific brilliance wasn't in brute force, it was in building tools, soldiers, pawns. His clones were programmed for obedience, stripped of free will. To Shockwave, they weren't lives, they were assets. This wasn't a mad scientist, this was a military-industrial architect, one who understood that to win a war, you don't just destroy your enemies, you reshape the battlefield itself. And perhaps the most frightening of all, he never lost his calm. Shockwave's deception had lasted for years. He had access to every secret, every plan, every vulnerability. The sheer scope of his infiltration wasn't just a tactical success, it was a philosophical one. It proved that logic, when weaponized, could corrode trust from the inside out. He wasn't driven by hatred, he didn't seek revenge, He simply believed that the Decepticon cause was a more efficient path forward, and he was willing to betray everything to see it realized. In that belief, it wasn't passion, it was math. This version of Shockwave might not have stacked as many bodies as his Marvel counterpart, but the wound he left behind was deeper. Not a scar on the planet, but a fracture in the soul of the Autobot ranks. Because betrayal isn't just a tactic, it's a worldview. And to Shockwave, it is simply logical. But sometimes logic becomes something more than a cold calculation. Sometimes it fuels belief, a prophecy, a purpose. And in one of the most tragic and terrifying arcs in Transformers history, Shockwave didn't just manipulate time, he became its architect. Before the madness, before the mask, before the name Onyx Prime echoed across time, Shockwave was just a student. A scholar with bright ideas, not cold intentions. In IDW's original continuity, the Spotlight Shockwave one-shot introduced him as a scientist conducting experiments on Cybertronian evolution, seemingly devoid of emotion. But that was the present-day version. His past, revealed in the Shadowplay arc, tells a different story. Shockwave once possessed a face, a voice, a soul. He wasn't ruthless, he was idealistic. He didn't want control, he wanted a better future. A student under the mentorship of G-Axis, Shockwave was a rising intellectual, curious, deeply principled, and committed to Cybertronian progress. He sought peaceful reform and transparency. His logic was gentle, even empathetic, a framework for improving society rather than conquering it. And here, he discovered something that changed everything, the dark Cybertron prophecy. Long before he became a senator, Shockwave found whispers of a forgotten future, of a great darkness to come, and of a Prime who would return through death to lead Cybertron to salvation. He didn't just read it, he believed it, and belief became obsession. He began to see the prophecy as a scientific inevitability, a formula waiting for the right variables to combine, and from that moment forward, every action he took was to prepare Cybertron, not just for survival, but for ascendance. As a senator, he advocated for long-term prosperity, rigorous oversight of political corruption, and strategic advancement. He spoke out against militarization, functionism, and unethical experimentation. He was trying to prevent catastrophe, but his growing radicalism made him dangerous to those in power, and so they broke him. Through barbaric imperata and the mind-bending effects of Shadowplay, they manipulated his body, removing his face and hand, and reprogrammed his mind to suppress emotion and free will. What emerged wasn't a scientist, it was a shell, a being of pure logic, stripped of the compassion that once drove him. The Decepticons didn't recruit Shockwave, they inherited him. And with nothing left to lose, he began constructing a plan that spanned galaxies and millennia. Project Regenesis. In Spotlight Shockwave and expanded through Dark Cybertron and its buildup, Shockwave seeded 13 planets with elemental ores, each one linked to a primal force. These ores weren't just weapons, they were keys to rewriting existence. To Shockwave, each planet was a variable, each experiment a proof. He wasn't building an empire, he was perfecting an equation, and once the final result was in place, Cybertron would become something new. His logic was horrifying in its precision, peace through physics, control through chemistry, and his long game, it worked. By the time of Dark Cybertron, his plans had matured. He used the ores to bend time and space, trap enemies in alternate dimensions, and eventually reshape Cybertron itself. His manipulation of the dead universe, Galvatron, and the Space Bridge network culminated in a plan to collapse all resistance, literally. But then, he disappeared. It wasn't until later, after Dark Cybertron had ended, that we learned where he went. Sent careening through time and space after the implosion of a time machine, Shockwave assumed the identity of Onyx Prime, one of Cybertron's ancient mythic progenitors. In this role, he wrote the very prophecy that had once inspired him, completing the time loop. The student became the prophet. The believer became the author, and belief became destiny. As Onyx Prime, Shockwave manipulated Cybertronian civilization for centuries. He orchestrated the rise of the Primes, manipulated galactic expansion, and secretly engineered chaos to accelerate his agenda. The Optimus Prime series would reveal that it was Shockwave, posing as Onyx, who destabilized alliances, reawakened old prejudices, and broke peace with the colonies. And then, when his role as a Prime was no longer useful, he cast it aside. He returned under his original name, ready to bring his millennia-spanning plan to fruition. His endgame, to establish a Cybertronian empire with Earth at its center, A new galactic order forged through this brand of cold peace, and then came the final variable, Unicron. In the Transformers Unicron event, we learned that Shockwave didn't just awaken the Chaos Bringer by accident. His were Genesis ores, 13 elemental anomalies seeded across the galaxy, were part of a larger calculus. Their presence had weakened the ancient seals that held Unicron at bay, but Shockwave intended to harness the resulting destruction. In his mind, Unicron's rampage was a necessary purge, a cleansing fire, one that would destabilize every government, erase resistance, and leave a shattered galaxy ripe for conquest. At its heart, Earth, not as a battlefield, but as the capital of his new empire. But he underestimated the one thing logic could never fully model: resilience. Across shattered colonies and burning worlds, Autobots, humans, and allies rose not in fear, but in defiance. In Optimus Prime issue 25, the final reckoning came. No more disguises, no more prophecy, just Shockwave. Alone, hollow, defeated. His end wasn't grandiose. He wasn't struck down in battle or swallowed by Unicron's maw. He was undone by the one variable he never accounted for: hope. Because logic may build empires, but it cannot hold them together. Not when belief turns to doubt. Not when destiny collapses under its own paradox. Shockwave tried to write the universe like an equation. In the end, not even logic could survive the storm it created. But Shockwave's masquerading as a god wouldn't end in the IDW continuity. Instead, it would continue. In the aligned continuity, spanning War for Cybertron, Fall of Cybertron, and Transformers Prime, Shockwave is more than a cold tactician. He is a god of cybernetic resurrection, a torturer of minds, and a scientist whose devotion to logic paved the road to monstrosity. From the beginning, his betrayal is hauntingly consistent. No ego, no rage, no chaos, only cold, methodical purpose. In War for Cybertron, he serves as Megatron's chief science officer, a shadowy figure working behind the curtain to build weapons, summon forbidden technologies, and test the boundaries of cruelty in the name of progress. He doesn't seek recognition, only results. Immorality, long since erased. But it's in Fall of Cybertron where Shockwave's horror truly blooms. He abducts Grimlock and the Lightning Strike Coalition, Slug, Swoop, Snarl, and Sludge, and subjects them to a nightmare of experimentation. His goal? To forge a new breed of Cybertronian warriors, fueled not by courage or code, but by raw instinct and primal fury. In his cold laboratory, logic becomes violation. Through invasive surgery, behavioral reprogramming, and the fusion of scanned Earth biosigns, he reshapes his prisoners into the monstrous Dinobots. Their alt modes, brutal, prehistoric, and alien, are not aesthetic flourishes, they are instruments of terror. Grimlock's mind is suppressed, his rage enhanced, and his identity nearly erased. To Shockwave, they are not soldiers, they are variables in an equation of conquest. But what Shockwave fails to account for is rebellion. Grimlock, fractured but not destroyed, leads his team in revolt. They tear through Shockwave's lab with primal vengeance, reducing the sterile experiment to wreckage. Shockwave survives, but the lesson is burned into logic. Life, no matter how engineered, cannot be perfectly controlled. Centuries later, in Transformers Prime, Shockwave returns, unchanged, unrepentant, and more dangerous than ever. While Megatron rules through fear and Starscream plots with vanity, Shockwave moves like a phantom, silent, focused, relentless. His obsession with ancient life persists, but now he seeks resurrection. In a secret lab, he uncovers fossilized remains of extinct Predacons, Cybertron's own mythic beast. From their dormant CNA, he initiates a cloning project. This time, he doesn't merely mimic beasts, he rebuilds them. The result? Predaking. An apex predator in every sense. Engineered for obedience, designed for war, a living embodiment of Shockwave's scientific ambition. Feral strength, bound by artificial chains. But once again, the leash snaps. Predaking develops language, strategy, will, and when he learns the truth of his origins, and that he is a clone, not a chosen king, he turns. The beast becomes a revolutionary, and Shockwave, his creator, becomes his target. And yet, Shockwave endures. In Predacons Rising, the final chapter of Prime, Shockwave awakens two more Predacons, Skylink and Darksteel, seeking to rebuild his vision, a new empire of engineered monsters, but fate has other plans. Megatron, now possessed by Unicron, turns on his own forces, and Shockwave, ever the loyal servant to logic, not ideology, refuses to let the Chaosbringer undo what reason has built. He stands his ground. He does not beg. He does not scream. He simply resists. And when the dust settles, he is gone, presumed dead but never confirmed, a ghost of science, a mind without monument, but his legacy unmistakable. Shockwave in the aligned continuity is the ultimate embodiment of science unbound by morality. He does not seek knowledge for understanding. He does not create for beauty. He weaponizes evolution. He brings life into being only to dominate it. And yet, his flaw is eternal. He can predict strength but not spirit. He can have evolution but not rebellion. He can clone life but never contain it. Because when logic forgets compassion, when control becomes obsession, even the sharpest mind cannot see the uprising coming. Not from soldiers, not from monsters, not from creation itself. But logic doesn't always emerge from laboratories or lost prophecies. Sometimes it crashes down without warning. No ideology, no voice, just devastation. And in one universe, built on fire and metal, Shockwave became a weapon without a conscience. In Transformers Dark of the Moon, Shockwave is not a master manipulator, he is the executioner. From beneath the streets of Chicago, he rises, not as a general, but as a walking extinction event, a towering cyclops fused to a biomechanical horror known only as the Driller. Gone is the cult strategist, gone is the whispering schemer and command centers. This Shockwave is something else, a silent juggernaut, armed with the astromag cannon and the kind of calculated malice that doesn't need words. He doesn't deliver monologues, he doesn't need to. His arrival at Chernobyl isn't random, it's a distraction. A surgical strike meant to mislead the Autobots while the Decepticons chase for a far greater prize. And when he emerges in Chicago, he doesn't charge in recklessly, he waits, he strikes. He separates Optimus from his trailer and unleashes Driller to collapse skyscrapers and crush all resistance. Shockwave doesn't shout, he hunts. He stalks Autobots through burning streets. He fires on the wreckers with dead-eye precision. He topples buildings only to bury human survivors in steel and ash. His one intelligible line, a guttural snarl of Optimus Prime's name, less language than curse. And yet, behind the monstrosity, there's still method. The Driller isn't chaos, it's Shockwave's scalpel, a precision tool in a war of annihilation. His entire presence is strategy wrapped in terror, but strategy can be undone. When the final assault comes, it's not in a grand battle of minds, it is brutality. The wreckers blind him. Optimus rips into him with knuckle spikes and fury, and in a final act of brutal violence, Prime tears Shockwave's optics from his skull, killing the last whisper of resistance. Even in death, he does not scream, and in that silence, he says more than words ever could. Because that Shockwave isn't a philosopher, he isn't a scientist, he is death, reduced to its most logical form, efficient, silent, and absolute. But Shockwave didn't need a voice to leave a mark. He carved it in steel, in silence, in the eyes of those who watched him level a city without the faintest flicker of doubt. And when his optic dangled, when his body was broken, there was no triumph, only unease. Because of this thing was just one version of Shockwave. What else waits in the dark? Across comics, games, and forgotten timelines, he's worn many faces. A time-traveling prophet, a rival warlord, a mind broken by logic so pure it shattered reality. Because logic doesn't die, it adapts. In Shockwave, he never stops calculating. Shockwave is more than a character, he's a concept. Logic incarnate, reshaped across universes. In these 5 iterations, we witness how his cold rationale adapts, distorts, and sometimes even fractures. In Transformers Cyberverse, Shockwave epitomizes cold, calculated evil. As the Decepticons' chief scientist, he conducts horrific experiments, including manipulating Clobber and Shadow Strike and building the Planet Smasher. He treats sentient beings as tools, variables in a grand experiment. This Shockwave lacks empathy entirely, viewing pain and suffering as irrelevant to his pursuit of efficiency. In the Shattered Glass universe, where moral polarities are inverted, Shockwave is no longer a monster. Logical, yes, but driven by empathy and a desire to save lives, not end them. He serves as a moral compass among the Decepticon rebels, striving to resist the cruelty of the Autobot regime. In a world turned upside down, Shockwave becomes something unthinkable, a symbol of compassion. In Transformers Earthspark, Shockwave returns not as a central villain, but as a remnant, a ghost. Once a feared war criminal, he now appears from the shadows, cloning Predacons, aiding Mandroid schemes, and reactivating old threats. He no longer seeks conquest, He studies, adapts, and persists. This Shockwave is as cold as ever, but in a post-war world, he is no longer a general, he's a relic. And most recently, in Skybound's Energon universe, Shockwave has only begun to make his move, but the signs are unmistakable. As the world shifts under Megatron's heel, Shockwave waits in the wings. He's not front and center, not yet, but his quiet manipulations are unfolding behind the scenes. His loyalty is clear, his vision is colder than war. It's about long-term control. He isn't just building weapons, he's writing history. Across these diverse portrayals, Shockwave's essence remains a relentless pursuit of logic, often at the expense of empathy. Whether as a rebel, a scientist, or a strategist, he challenges our understanding of morality, forcing us to confront the cost of reason untempered by compassion. But this begs the question, what is fear without rage? What is evil without ego? Shockwave doesn't conquer through cruelty. He doesn't seduce with charisma. He endures the trials and tribulations of life by removing its emotional components. Across generations, he has remained a constant threat, not because he fights harder, but because he thinks further. While others scream on the battlefield, Shockwave whispers behind the curtain. He is the war no one sees coming, the betrayal no one anticipates, the variable no one accounts for until it's already too late. And when the war ends, he doesn't vanish, he recalculates. In Marvel Comics, he dethroned Megatron and rewrote the laws of creation. In IDW, he became a prophet and a prime, looping time itself into a perfect paradox. In Cyberverse, he turned science into a scalpel. In Animated, he wore the Autobots' trust like a disguise and shattered them from within. Even in Silence, in Dark of the Moon, he was terror incarnate. And in every timeline, aligned, Energon, Earthspark, he waits for the opportune moment to strike, not out of ambition, but because his logic demands it. Shockwave is the ultimate counterpoint to characters like Optimus Prime. Where Prime believes in choice, Shockwave believes in control. Where Prime protects freedom, Shockwave eliminates chaos. He's not the opposite of hope. He is what hope must survive. And this is what makes him timeless, because no matter the continuity, no matter the battle, no matter the cost, Shockwave is still calculating, still waiting. And in some distant future, when trust erodes, when order collapses, when freedom forgets what it costs to be won, he will return. After all, what's more inevitable than logic? Because if freedom is a choice, Shockwave is the consequence. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive through the mind of Cybertron's coldest intellect. Shockwave is more than a villain, he's a mirror, a reflection of what happens when thought is severed from feeling, when precision becomes ideology, when logic becomes law. Until next time, stay sharp, stay thoughtful, and as always, stay handsome. And remember, the scariest enemy isn't the one charging at you, it's the one planning the attack.